Okay, so now today I want to finish talking about indirect speech acts, and let me locate where we are in the material of the course. We're at the stage now where I'm talking about applications of the theory of language that I presented you at the beginning, and the applications now will be dealing largely with cases where you have a speaker meaning that differs from the sentence meaning. And you see, you're able to understand a language because you understand what the sentences mean. Now, you know how you do that. You do that by way of compositionality and then generativity. You can understand new sentences because you know what the words mean and you know what the rules are for combining those words into sentences. Also, you know that there's no end of new sentences that can be produced. Compositionality tells you how to figure out the meaning of the sentence from the meaning of the words and their combination. Generativity tells you how to figure out new sentences you've never heard before. So you hear the difference between John loves Mary and Mary loves John by way of compositionality, but the fact that you can then get, strictly speaking, an indefinite number of relative clauses. John loves Mary, who met my aunt who lives in Kansas City where they used to have a good baseball team, and then you go on and on and on. You can keep going with that. That's generativity. Okay, now it is the understanding of the literal meaning of sentences that enables you to speak a language at all. But of course, in actual social situations, in actual life, you have to be able to figure out what people are saying when they go beyond or mean something different from the literal meaning of the sentence. And there we have to figure out how that works, and there are a series of principles that enable it to work. Now, the first and the simplest cases are the cases of indirect speech acts where you say what you mean, but you mean something more. So in that case, you have a literal meaning which is inside the speaker meaning. If this is the speaker meaning, then inside here is the literal meaning. So the guy says, "You're standing on my foot," but you know his speaker meaning is, "Please get off my foot." The guy says, "Do you know the way to the Palace Hotel?" thus asking you a question about your knowledge, but you know that that is a request for you to tell him the way to the Palace Hotel. The guy says, "Can you close the window?" And you know that's a question about your ability, but you know that it's a request. And we're trying to figure out what are the principles on which those, they're quite systematic, what are the principles on which those indirect speech acts work. But the general feature of indirect speech acts is that you have to be able to infer an intended speaker meaning that includes the literal sentence meaning but goes beyond the literal sentence meaning. Now, some authors have said that the literal sentence meaning is not intended at all, but that has to be wrong, and there's a simple proof, and that is that the response to the literal meaning is always appropriate in an indirect speech act. So in an indirect speech act, if the guy says to you, "Can you open the window?" it's perfectly appropriate to say, "No, I can't. I got a broken arm," or "Yes, I can. I'll do it for you." So the response to the literal is always appropriate in a way that it's not appropriate with metaphors or a sarcasm or hyperbole and all these other sorts of cases that we will consider shortly. Okay, so our task in indirect speech acts is to figure out how the speaker is able to intend something that goes beyond the literal meaning, and yet how it is the case that the hearer can readily understand the indirect speech act, even though all he hears is the sentence with its literal meaning. And last time I gave you the two sets of principles by which he is able to figure that out. On the one hand, he has the Gricean principles of conversation, and in particular the principle of relevance, the principle, or the, as Grice calls it, the maxim of relevance. So when the guy says, can you pass the salt, you take it for granted that that's relevant, that utterance is relevant to the situation you're in. You're at the dinner table, and you don't think that it would be relevant for him just to ask you a question about your salt passing abilities. So the principle of relevance tells you something's wrong with the speech act if you just take it literally. That's stage one. Stage two, you've got to figure out what he actually intended. You have to figure out how the intended speaker meaning goes beyond the literal sentence meaning. And that's what I argued last time, is where the theory of speech acts comes into play. So if you look at indirect speech acts, you'll find they're quite systematic. There are all sorts of ways, systematic ways of performing an indirect speech act. And I asked you to imagine all the ways that you could ask somebody to do something fairly trivial, like passing the salt at a dinner table, without actually saying, please pass the salt. And we saw that there are a whole lot of ways. You can ask him, are you able to pass the salt? You could pass the salt. You can pass the salt. Could you please pass the salt? Those are preparatory conditions about the speaker's ability. Remember, the preparatory condition on a directive speech act is that the speaker is, about the hearer's ability, that the hearer is able to perform the act that he or she is being directed to perform. And we saw that in those cases, in the can you, could you cases, they admit of both the assertive, you can or you could, as well as the interrogative, can you or could you. The interrogative is more polite because it appears to give the hearer an option. You can, to an interrogative, to a question, you can always answer yes or no, even if in fact it's not actually, you're not actually giving the hearer an option. It's more polite to appear to give the hearer an option. Okay, so that's one class of cases, the preparatory condition concerning the hearer's ability. You can either assert it or ask whether it exists. Now, the second condition concerns the speaker's sincerity condition on the directive, and that is that the speaker wants the hearer to do something. And there we have all sorts of examples. I want you to do this for me. I'd like you to do that. I'd appreciate it if, I'd be most grateful if. All of those are expressions of a desire. And you remember, the desire is the sincerity condition on the directive. And then, of course, there is the next condition, which is the propositional content condition. And there, the propositional content of the directive is that the hearer actually does it. And once again, you get both the assertive and the interrogative. You get the assertive, officers will wear ties at dinner. That just says what's going to happen. That's the propositional content. But also, you get the interrogative, will you please make less noise, where the request there is make less noise. So I hope you see what's going on. What's going on is that the theory of speech acts applies to indirect speech acts quite systematically. You can ask the guy to do something either by telling him that or asking him whether he has the ability. You can ask him to do it by telling him that you want him to do it, but not normally by asking him whether you want him to do it. Why? Well, for the Cartesian reasons, namely, you're in a better position than anybody else to tell what your desires are. You don't normally ask people what your desires are. You tell them what your desires are. But then when you get to his doing it, you can either ask whether he will do it, or you can tell him that he will do it. Once again, much more polite to ask whether. It's possibly rude in most cases to just give a flat assertion that you're going to do something. You will make less noise is a way of telling people not to make noise, but it is much less polite than the interrogative form with a preparatory condition, could you make less noise, or even less polite than will you make less noise. Okay, so those are the three sets of conditions that are quite systematic. The hearer's ability, the speaker's desire, and the hearer is actually doing that. And you all recognize that as three types of conditions on the performance of the speech act: the preparatory condition, the sincerity condition, and the propositional content condition. Now, you can also get cases, I don't discuss these in the article you read, where you actually assert the essential condition. Remember, the essential condition on directives is you're trying to get somebody to do something. And you can just plainly assert that. I'm trying to get you to leave us alone can be a request to leave us alone. And that's where you assert the presence of the essential condition on the speech act. Okay, now with all of those, I think that's fairly clear, and I'm essentially repeating what I said last time. But then with all of those, the whole discussion of language locks into human rationality generally. And in the case of indirect directives, you can perform the directive either by asking whether or stating that there is a reason for performing it. And you get some nice complexities here that will be fun to work out. So, for example, ought and should typically express reasons for action. So you can tell a guy to do something by telling him that he ought to do it. You ought to stop drinking by 10 o'clock because you've got to drive home later and you don't want to be arrested for drunk driving. You ought to stop drinking can be a directive there. It can be a request to the guy to stop drinking. Now with the interrogatives, though, you get peculiar reversal. If you say to the guy, well, should you really drink a whole glass of bourbon this time of night? That typically is a negative order or a negative directive. That tells him you shouldn't. Why does it do that? Well, by challenging him to provide a reason why he should, in a case where it's obvious that there is no reason why he should, you imply that the absence of a reason for doing it is itself a reason for not doing it. So, should you really be drinking so much booze, and it's when it's obvious that there's no reason for drink so much of this heavy duty, I'm imaging all sorts of dreadful drinks that come to mind here. That the absence of a reason for him to be drinking this is itself a reason for not drinking this. And that's very common. You're driving along the road and you say to somebody, well, why not stop here for lunch? And that's not so much a request for reasons for not stopping there, but it's an indirect request to stop there on the assumption that unless they can provide a good reason for stopping there, then that is a reason. Unless they can provide a good reason for not stopping there, then we have a reason for stopping there. It's lunchtime, we're all hungry, etc. So it's quite nice to work out all of the complexities of these indirect speech acts. And it'd be interesting to know, I don't actually know, how different cultures vary in the amount of indirection that is regarded as essential and polite. My experiences, and this is just unsystematic tourist experiences, is the Japanese probably lead the world in indirection. The Chinese, by comparison, are much more direct. But the Japanese like to beat around the bush and don't like to say things straight out if they can possibly avoid it. This is probably due to some deep cultural sensibility. But in any case, it's interesting to compare different cultures with how much is direct and how much is indirect. Okay, now I think all of that gives us a pretty good account of the most common form of indirect speech acts, namely indirect directives. And as I said before, indirect directives are very common in ordinary speech simply because it's not very polite just to tell people flat out to do something. It's much more polite to ask them if they could or would or want to, or tell them you'd like them to, or you sure would appreciate it if. And remember, I've told you several times that typically when people ask me for a letter of recommendation, they don't come in and say, write me a letter of recommendation. Indeed, they don't even come in and say, please write me a letter of recommendation, but they have wonderful indirect speech acts. Would you mind awfully, I know you're awfully busy, but would it be too much trouble if, and I was considering going to law school, and it would help me. You can compose the thing yourself, and that's simply because it's much more polite. I know what they're driving at, and I've been doing this for a while, so I know how to do it. But I'm impressed by the forms in which the request is made. Okay, now if I'm right about all that stuff, then it ought to predict it would work for other kinds of speech acts as well, and I'm now going to consider that. Again, almost all of what I'm telling you in lecture is in the assigned reading, so I'll go through it fairly fast. But let's stop for questions. Question about what I've said so far about directives. We're interested in how, and it's an interesting question, it makes a good exam question. How many ways can you think of telling people to do something without actually coming out flatly and saying, do it? By the way, back to cultures, I always have the impression that in Germany you hear the imperative mood more often than you do in French. In France, the subjunctive still survives. It's hanging on. I don't know why, but the subjunctive appears to be dying in just about all languages, and it's almost gone out of English. You do get these odd locations like far be it from me, but very few people say things like would that it rained more in Berkeley. I like to say that kind of crap, but most people don't say that. Now they do have a peculiar substitute for that. They say things like, if only we had more snow. And you want to say, yeah, then what? That's a conditional. You know, when the stewardess in the airplane says to me, if I could see your passport, please. If? Well, what's the condition? Yeah, then what? If you could see my passport, then what? You know, I'm a logician. I get paid to think about questions like that. But the stewardess never worries about that. She just says, again, if I could see your passport, please. But that is an odd indirect request. And I guess at some deep level, I don't understand it. Why do people use the conditional if-then when there isn't any consequent? That is, it's just if I could see your passport, I guess the implication is supposed to be, then it would be awfully nice, or I sure would appreciate it, or something like that. But they don't say flat out, I would appreciate it if you would give me your passport, but they say if I could see your passport. Another good test, by the way, for these indirect speech acts is, can you stick please on the end? Can you please, or even insert it, can you please make less noise? Would you please leave the room? All of those will take please. And please, again, is one of those words that suggests that it's a request rather than an order. The highway department doesn't say, please don't go over 65 miles an hour, because that would imply that you have a choice. If you please, I'll take a question in a second. But they say no, speed limit 65. So there are all these subtleties. But anyway, going back to the question of other speech acts, I think these things work for other speech acts. You can perform just about any speech act by asserting that you have the sincerity condition. So you can apologize by saying, I'm sorry. You can thank somebody by saying, I'm grateful. You can congratulate somebody by saying, I'm glad. All of those are the sincerity conditions on apologies, thanks, and congratulations. And in general, you can perform any speech act by asserting that you have the sincerity condition. Now, you can't do it if it's a big deal formal situation. If you want to declare war, you got to come out and say it. You can't say it by asserting the sincerity condition. We want to declare war, and we believe we're going to declare war. No, that's no good. You got to say, we declare war. You have to, in a formal situation where the actual locution matters, you can't use the indirect speech act forms. Okay, I want to go on and talk about commissives, because you get the same principles apply to commissives. Let's take questions, though. You had a question. Yes.
Grammatically it works, because like if you say where's the Palace Hotel and I say yes, I mean I know that's Claudia Grace's maximum. So
No, the question is, do you know the way to the Palace Hotel?
Yeah, but if I say yes and then walk away.
Then that's wrong. But the literal response is appropriate, but never enough by itself. So if somebody says to me, do you know the way to the Palace Hotel? it's perfectly okay for me to say, yes, it's 3 blocks down and to the left, or no, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. Both of the literal response appropriate. In a way that it's not appropriate to metaphor. If I say the Palace Hotel is an albatross on the Geneva economy, it won't do to say, and how high does the albatross fly? Unless albatrosses fly, I hope. Anyway, in this example, they do. Unless, of course, you're just continuing the metaphor. That is, you can make a metaphorical response to a metaphorical utterance. If I say, God, that restaurant meal was awful, I just ate a dead horse, it won't do to say things like, well, what color was the horse? Or, well, okay, you get the point. So the literal response is appropriate in the indirect speech act, but of course it's never enough by itself unless it's a negative. Can you reach the salt? No, I have a broken arm, I can't reach anything. Yes, I can, here it is. But it's a joke if in response to can you just say, yes, I can, and then don't do anything. Now, of course, there could be cases where only the literal was intended. You've got a broken arm, and the doctor says, well, how much is your healing progressive? Can you do things like reach the salt? Can you reach the salt? And you just answer, yes, I'm able to do that kind of stuff. It's just I can't do push-ups. Okay, but that's a very unusual case. I mean, psychiatrists' offices and doctors' offices don't count for standard indirect speech acts, though you can take them as examples where sometimes the literal meaning would be appropriate. I don't know. I've never been to a psychoanalyst, but maybe it's okay to ask your psychoanalyst, do I really want to marry Sally or whatever, whereas normally you don't ask people about your desires. Yes?
Well, I was also just kind of, this is a little off topic, but I was curious after like studying indirect speech acts so much. I remember when I first was introduced to it, I was like uncomfortable then using them because I realized so much more. So what do you, like, when people come to you using all these indirect speech acts, are you kind of just bothered by it? Like,
No, I'm quite used to it. I appreciate politeness. The survival of civilization has become more and more interesting to me as its survival seems less and less likely. I think one mark of civilization is that certain forms of apparently inefficient and unnecessary social niceties are routinely practiced. Now, it's possible to overdo it. When I was an undergraduate in Oxford, if you had, say, half a dozen undergraduates approaching a door, it was virtually impossible to negotiate the door because it was very low status to be the first person through. So you stood and for the other guy and watched half a dozen Christchurch undergraduates approaching the door to the dining hall. That was a pretty tough negotiation. Better sneak in by yourself because, of course, if you went in first, you were marking yourself as pretty boorish. So the mark of the aristocratic person was a certain sort of indirection in conversation. I mean, you never just invited people like that, but you had ways of dressing up. I'm thinking of having a few people over for drinks. I wonder if you could. I wonder if you'd mind if it would be possible for you. And that stutter was also regarded as very good. What happens in a stutter? You see, I mean, most Americans don't understand this point at all. If you have a slight stutter, people will pay very close attention. Everybody shuts up and leans forward to hear what you're going to say. So among affectations, among speech act affectations, the stutter is extremely effective. Now, if it's just too bad, well then, okay, people will get bored and go away. But a slight stutter that attracts people's attention and gets them sitting on the edge of their seat, that is very effective in producing the perlocutionary effect. Okay, and now another thing, Americans are unaware about accents and their position in the class system. But cultures that have a stratified class system, the class is often marked by the accent with which you speak. I was once living with a guy, and I said, there was a phone call for you, and he said, well, who was it from? I said, I didn't know. He said, yes, but did he have a Balliol accent or a Trinity accent? Those are two Oxford colleges. And I had to say, I didn't know what the hell a Balliol accent, how a Balliol accent differed from a Trinity accent. But those were, the accent with which you spoke was an important part of your self-presentation in a stratified society. Not much in the United States, though it is to some extent. I noticed that in Toyota ads for trucks, they try to, it's a Japanese truck maker, they have a guy come on and advertise a truck who obviously has a Western American accent. Just an old country boy telling you how great the pickup is. You see, I used to drive pickups in Wyoming, so I recognize the accent that they're attempting to imitate. But in general, Americans don't care about accents as much as other cultures do, or as much as some other cultures do. Okay, other questions. We're talking now primarily about directives. I'm going to go on and talk about commissives. Yeah, you had a question. Yeah.
So why do other philosophers think that literal meaning is not at all important?
Oh, they think literal meaning is important, but what they think is that in the Indirect Speech Act, you do not convey the literal meaning. And I think that's exactly wrong, that it's only because the hearer understands the literal meaning that he understands the Indirect Speech Act as something going beyond the literal meaning. Now, I think the reason that they make the mistake of supposing that the literal meaning is not intended is that it's never enough by itself to just respond to the literal meaning. And I think that was the point of her first question. So if you ask me, do you know the way to the Durant Hotel, and I look you straight in the eye and say, yes, I do, then that's no good. I mean, that's just missing the point of the question. Remember, of course, all questions are requests. They are directives. They are requests for the performance of a speech act, and I assume this is true in other language as well. And you sense that by thinking of the equivalence. If I say to you, what's the name of the first president of the United States? You hear that as equivalent to, tell me the name of the first president of the United States. Both the question form, what is, and the directive, tell me, have the same illocutionary force because questions are species of directive. They differ from other directives, and in that you don't typically get an entire propositional content. You get, as I pointed out before, if with a WH question is what, who, where, why, how, you get a propositional content with an X with a variable in it. How many people came to the party is equivalent to X number, tell me the value of X and X number of people came to the party. But anyway, the short answer to why they make this mistake, and I'm not sure, maybe Grice made it as well. You'd have to read it, read Grice closely. But I think the reason they make the mistake is they suppose that when the answer is yes, it's never enough just to respond to the literal meaning. So they mistakenly suppose, well, the literal meaning doesn't figure in the interpretation of the utterance, and that's wrong. Okay, well, let's go on now to consider the case of commissives. Everybody up with us on directives, that is on orders, requests, and commands where you can do these things. Where you do these things indirectly. Now again, let me emphasize that the more formal the situation, the less likely that you will hear the indirect form. If it's a court order or something like that, then you don't get indirection. It's a matter more of conversation. Okay, let's consider commissives. Now, remember the commissives, the most famous class is the promise, but it includes vows and pledges and commitments of various kinds. Conversationally, the most common commissive is the offer. You offer something to somebody. And the reason that is the most common is that it is a conditional promise. If I offer you something, then I become committed to the thing I offer you to on the condition that you accept the offer. And you can, the same pattern that we saw in the directives you get for offers. So one way to make an offer to somebody is to say that you are able. You say, I can help you out with that, or I could help you out with that. That's an offer, and if it's accepted, then it becomes a promise. It becomes a commitment. And again, just as we saw in the case of directives, that the preparatory condition admitted either of an assertive or of an interrogative. So that's true of can I and could I. You can say things like, not only can I help you, but I can help you with that, or I could help you with that. And there you perform the offer by saying or asking whether you satisfy the preparatory condition of the ability. I can, I could, can I, could I can both be indirect offers. Now similarly, with just as in the case of directives, we saw that you can perform the indirect directive with an assertion of the sincerity condition. I want you to do this for me, Henry. I want you to do it for me and Cynthia and all the little children. That's an indirect request for you to do it by asserting that I satisfy the sincerity condition. Well, similarly, in the case of the sincerity condition on commissives, I intend to do this for you. I plan to do it. Are cases where I intend to do it. I plan on doing it. Those are cases where you assert the presence of the sincerity condition. But just as it seems odd to query the presence of the sincerity condition in the case of directives, do I want you to do it? So it seems odd in the case of commissives, do I intend to do it? Because for essentially the Cartesian reasons, you know better than anybody else what your mental states are. Okay, now similarly with the propositional content condition, you get the assertion of the propositional content condition. I will do this for you can be a promise to do it simply by asserting that you satisfy the propositional content. You also get the query of that, shall I do it for you, will be an offer if somebody answers yes, please do it. Now again, as I've told you, these will, shall combinations in English have always puzzled me, and I hope one of you will work it out. But in any case, the shall I is a peculiar locution in English because it's the only case I know where you ask a question and the answer typically is not yes, you shall, or even yes, you will, but rather the imperative, yes, do, no, don't. So if I say to you, shall I marry a Republican? The answer is not yes, you will, or no, you won't, or yes, you shall, or no, you shall not, which are odd anyway. But the requested answer is something like yes, do, or no, don't. You're requesting advice, but the advice typically takes the form of a directive. Anyway, as far as indirect speech acts are concerned, the propositional content can be typically more comfortably asserted. I will do this for you, but it can also be queried, as in the shall I or will I. Okay, now just also as we saw that stating the reasons for an action can also can be the way of performing a directive. So it can be the way of performing a commissive. You need my help would be a case, or I ought to help you with that. Those are assertions of reasons for my performing the action, and they can be indirect forms of the commissive. Okay, so that's the general account of indirect speech acts, and just to summarize, the pattern of indirect speech acts, the pattern of its understanding is essentially two stages. First, you have to see that there's something wrong with the utterance as it stands, and that's typically done by the Gricean maxim of relevance. As it stands, the utterance doesn't have much relevance to the conversation. Can you pass the salt? You're standing on my foot. So you look for some way that might be relevant, and that's where the speech act theory comes into play, because if I say, can you pass the SALT, I've asked your question about your ability, and it's part of your competence in speech acts that you know that the ability is a preparatory condition on the issuance of a directive. When I say leave the room, I presuppose that you have the ability to leave the room. So when I say, can you pass the SALT, I am querying the presence of the preparatory condition, and given the requirement of relevance, you will naturally interpret that, or typically you will interpret that as a directive to pass the SALT. Okay, so much for indirect speech acts. Let's then take questions about all that. Any question about what I've said? You have your hand up? Yeah. Can you say it a bit louder?
Yeah, I'm wondering how we distinguish indirect speech acts from sometimes like error in understanding.
Yeah.
What keeps coming to my mind is airplane actually. In the indirect speech act there, she said something to us carefully, well, surely, this is going to happen. He says, my name's not Shirley.
Yeah.
How do we distinguish?
Yeah, that's a misunderstanding, because what she presented as an adjective, as an adverb, surely, yeah, you took as a proper name, as a form of address. But that's just a typical misunderstanding. I mean, that's a case of misunderstanding the semantic content of the sound uttered. But is there any special problem about that?
Well, just more generally, that was just kind of
Yeah.
like how we distinguish indirect speech acts
Yeah.
from, speech acts that are sort of
Yeah.
and
Okay, and there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is that you bring to bear an enormous cognitive apparatus, particularly the background. You have a background for what happens when you eat in a restaurant, fly on an airplane, take a course in a university, and you interpret the utterances in the light of your background dispositions and capacities. You also have a network of factual information. The plane is 2 hours late, and they're trying to make apologetic noises, so they're offering you free booze or whatever they do nowadays. I don't suppose they offer free booze anymore, but they used to a long time ago. So you have factual information. However, I want to emphasize over and over the importance of the background in interpretation. If I say to you, have you had breakfast, you will interpret the question about the past tense occurrence of an event quite differently from if I say to you, have you been to Tibet? If I say to you, have you had breakfast, it seems okay to say things like, yes, at 8:30. But if I say to you, have you been to Tibet? It would sound odd to say, yeah, what time is it? Yes, at 8:30. I went to Tibet. Now, how do you know that? You do know that. You do know that have you been to Tibet is understood differently from have you had breakfast. Easy to imagine a culture where the opposite was the case. Well, maybe not easy, but with a little effort, you can imagine it. Imagine a culture in which you only have breakfast maybe once every 20 years, if that often, whereas Tibet, well, I mean, several times a minute. You go to Tibet and back just to check in. So if I say to you, have you had breakfast? And you might say, well, not since 2003, but I did once in 2003. Have you been to Tibet? Yes, several times. What time is it? Yeah, I'm going in the next few seconds. Now you can imagine that, but that's not the life we actually live. In the life we actually live, it's a big deal and a rare thing to go to Tibet, whereas eating breakfast is something that happens every day, and that's part of understanding. Part of understanding is having this background information and the cognitive capacities that go with it. However, one interesting subject that ought to be explored more is forms of misunderstanding and how they get communicated. I mean, that is, how it is that the misunderstanding is produced and how it's possible to correct it once it has been produced. Okay, other questions about that? Yes?
You were just talking about how indirect speech acts fit in with speech act theory, and I just
Yeah.
want to make sure I'm seeing the correlation. You brought up preparatory, sincerity, and propositional content. Like,
Yeah.
will you just remind me?
Yes,
Of
remember how it goes. On any speech act, it's an assertive or a directive or a commissive, or any of the other types of speech acts, an expressive various kind, there are preparatory conditions. What must be the case, what you presuppose is the case in order that you can get it off the ground. So if you make a promise, you presuppose that you're able to do it. That's a preparatory condition. The sincerity condition, in the case of a promise, if it's sincere, you have to intend to do it. The propositional content condition, in the case of a promise, is that you will do it. The essential condition, that it's an undertaking to do it. Now, all of those conditions can function in the Indirect Speech Act. So you can make a promise by asserting that you have the preparatory condition, that you satisfied. I can help you. Or you can ask, can I help you? Could I help you? That's the preparatory condition. Then there's a sincerity condition. I intend to help you. I plan on helping you. And then there is the cases where you lay it out as an assertion, the assertion of the essential condition. I am committing myself to doing this for you, where you assert that you satisfy the essential condition. Well, it is. That's not necessarily a promise. I mean, you can just say, I intend to help you, but I won't promise. Remember, I told you the story about the Oxford philosopher who was so precise and he got so obsessed about promising that he couldn't make any promises. If you asked him to lunch, he would say, I intend to come to lunch. I fully intend to come to lunch. And that was true. He did satisfy the sincerity condition, but he couldn't actually bring himself to say, I will come to lunch, because that's a promise, and he didn't know how anybody could do anything as heavy, metaphysically heavy as that. Yeah. So all of these indirect forms will be taken normally as the performance of the Speech Act, for which they are the indirect form. I intend to do it. Would typically be taken as a promise, but it needn't be. You can say, I fully intend to do this, but I don't promise. In fact, I often do that. People say, will you give us a lecture in wherever it is? And I say, well, look, I intend to come, but I can't promise yet because I don't know about my other commitments. That's a typical way of getting out of making a promise. Yeah. You follow that? Yeah.
I still quite see how intend is, it's not indirect in the same way as it's asking about your ability to like...
No, why? Because the sincerity condition is much more intimately connected with the performance of the Speech Act. The whole point of the Speech Act is to say that you intend, but to say it in a way that commits you, that obligates you, that binds you. And you can have the intention without the commitment or the obligation. Yes?
What if you say, like, have a piece of cake?
Yes, okay. No, that's a beautiful example. Yeah. All right. Now, I said that it's rude to use the imperative mood, and I'm always vaguely uncomfortable in Germany when it seems to me people use the imperative mood more. But it's not rude to use the imperative mood if it's not really an imperative, if it's not a directive, but a kind of commissive. So people come into my office and I say, have a seat, take a chair. And they don't say things like, don't boss me around, or why are you ordering me around? Because they understand that's not a directive, that's an offer. Now, similarly, when you go to the hostess for the house for the party, and she says, have some cake, that's not an order, that's an offer. Even though it's in the imperative mood. You don't say, you can't boss me around, I don't have to have any cake if I don't want to. You will miss the point. So there's an interesting asymmetry in English, and I literally don't know how widespread this is in other languages. And throughout this course, if you're fluent, I mean really good in a language other than English, it's interesting to know. I mean, if you can really speak Malayan or Chinese or Swahili or Egyptian, I'd like to know how these points work in other languages. But in English, it's perfectly polite to use the imperative mood if it's obvious that it's not really an order, that you're not really telling somebody to do something, you're making an offer. So have some cake, sit down, take a chair, make yourself comfortable. Those are not orders. They're not directives. They're all Well, most of them are offers. When I say have some cake, that's an offer. How about make yourself comfortable? I think that's probably an expressive. I wish you will become comfortable. Yeah. Yeah. Give me an example.
You could say, don't you hate it when you have guests who trash their life shoes?
Yeah.
Take their
Well, and what's the Indirect Speech Act? I mean, sometimes I say, yeah, I do. I collect Oriental rugs, and there's nothing I hate worse than a guy who uses his metal cleats to chew up the Kazakh. In fact, yeah, those people, I make them take off their shoes. But in those cases, I don't use an Indirect Speech Act. I say things like, please take off your shoes. Well, sometimes I use an Indirect Speech Act. In this house, because we have so many antique Oriental rugs, we ask people to take their shoes off. That's an Indirect Speech Act. And people don't say, oh, well, that's an interesting sociological fact or interesting observation. Now, I've stopped doing that, by the way, because I find it uncomfortable to walk around the house with no shoes on. So if I keep shoes on, I can't ask other people to take their shoes off. And the Kazakhs and the Kazakhs I put on the wall. Yes. Okay, other questions? Everybody's up with us. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, I see. Oh, that's good. That's a good Indirect Speech Act. I haven't thought about that one. But the way that that would work, at least in the account that I have given you, well, interesting. Work it out. Write it down. Because the way I would say it off the top of my head is this has to do with reasons for action. If you think that other people have a reason for acting in this way, wouldn't that reason also function in your own case? That's off the top of my head, but I haven't thought about it. It'd be interesting to, you might try working it out. How is it that the Speech Act is intended and understood? Okay, well, let's go on to some other topics. Now, because we're going to have kind of an upset in our scheduling, because I have to go away, and then we've got the Thursday off, and then we've also got Thanksgiving off. We don't have an awful lot more sessions. So what I'm going to do in the few minutes left are raise some other topics that I want you to think about, and then we'll go into those in more detail. The first and most obvious topic is metaphor. We ought to say something about metaphor. And the question about metaphor, as I treat it in the article that I've asked you to read, is like the question about Indirect Speech Acts. How is it possible for a speaker to convey one thing when he or she says something else? And a lot of metaphors occur in poetry, but there are lots of perfectly ordinary metaphors in ordinary speech. It needn't be a fancy poetic metaphor. Now, often the metaphor functions to fill a semantic gap. There just isn't any word, so we use a metaphorical term. And in those cases, the metaphor typically becomes a dead metaphor rapidly and acquires a new literal meaning. Think of mouse for the thing you hold in your hand when you operate your computer. The word mouse came up there because we didn't have a word for those, and it's sort of like a mouse. Not really, but sort of like a mouse, so you adopt the metaphor, which now acquires a new literal meaning. If you go into a store and say you need a mouse for your Dell computer, nobody will go bring you a rodent. That's just not going to happen. And a good test for this is how do the exceptional cases work? Mice is the plural of mouse, but in the case where you've got a metaphor, and especially a dead metaphor, do you treat the metaphor the way you treat the original literal, or do you treat it separately? In the case when you go into the store and you need more than one mouse, you need a mouse for yourself and a mouse for Jones and a mouse for Smith. What do you say? Do you say, I need 3 mice? that sounds funny to me. On the other hand, it doesn't sound very comfortable to say, I need 3 mouses. And I just don't know what I would say in a situation like that. But I need 3 mice for 3 computers. But that shows you that you got something funny going on there. And what's funny is that the mouse is still functioning partly as a metaphor there. And insofar as it has acquired a new literal meaning, we're not quite sure whether or not the treatment of the original irregular noun, whereby it takes an irregular plural, mouse to mice, applies to the new meaning of the word mouse. Anyway, that's one common source of metaphor, is you just have a semantic gap, and you fill it by using a term where the meaning is something like the gap filler that you need. The mouse does look the computer mouse does look a bit like a mouse. It's got a fattish body and a long tail, and so you fill that gap. Often people will learn the metaphorical meaning before they learn the literal meaning. When I was a kid, I used to mess around with oscillographs, and it wasn't until much later that I understood mosaic did not refer to the pattern on the computer screen in the oscillograph, the mosaic plate, but originally meant a way of structuring pavement. And it'd be interesting to track that down. Does that come from Moses? I don't think so, but I've forgotten. You might look that up. Does mosaic actually come from Moses in the sense of a tile mosaic, a floor or walkway mosaic? I think not. Okay, so that's a typical source of metaphor, but of course the most dramatic forms of metaphors are the poetic metaphors, and there the question about metaphors, I've been posing it, is the question, how is it possible that the speaker understands the non-literal metaphorical meaning differently from the literal sentence meaning? In other words, I've treated the problem of metaphor as a special case of the problem of the distinction between literal sentence meaning and intended speaker's meaning, where those come apart. Now, the pattern in metaphor is not like this, but if you have S is P, you say S is P, and you have the literal meaning here, and then you have the metaphorical meaning, and you get to the metaphorical meaning by going through the literal meaning. So if I say, well, the Democratic agenda has become a dead horse after the recent election, you get to the metaphorical meaning by going through the literal meaning. So the literal meaning functions, but it's not what is understood. It's not the final understanding of the utterance. The literal meaning functions as a guide to the intended speaker's meaning, and it's pretty clear. Now, often you get a whole range of intended speakers' meanings. So when in Romeo and Juliet, when Romeo says Juliet is the sun, that's clearly a metaphor. And the standard textbook account says, well, metaphors always assert a similarity, that it says that the metaphorical object is like or similar to the literal metaphorical meaning, or to the extension of the literal sentence meaning. But I don't think that works in this case. When I say Juliet is the sun, I don't mean she's like an extremely hot but largely gaseous body. I certainly don't mean literally. Juliet is, for the most part, gaseous and 93 million miles from the Earth. So what does Romeo mean when he says Juliet is the sun? Well, I think there are a range of things that he means. He means, my day begins with Juliet. Juliet shines a great deal of light on my life, but notice that's another metaphor there. That is, I'm using metaphors to explain metaphors. So rather lamely, I say in these poetic metaphors, you just don't get a single metaphorical meaning, you get a whole range of them. And part of the effect of poetry is it does convey, I mean good poetry, it does convey a range of meanings. Now, in dead metaphor, what happens is you go from S is P to S is R. Let this be R here and this be P. And then you just sidetrack that. You go just directly to the, in dead metaphor, you go directly to the intended speaker meaning. So I think, for example, most of us don't hear leg of the table or the head of the table as metaphors for body parts, for legs and feet. When I hear he kicked the leg of the table, I don't think it's like kicking somebody in the shin. I never think of actual human or animal legs when somebody says the leg of a table. That's a dead metaphor. It's acquired a new literal meaning. And similarly, I think with a computer mouse, I don't think somehow, I don't go, when I think of, oh, I need to replace the mouse on my Dell computer, I don't think of something that's like actual mice running around in the basement of the house. And the test for whether or not it has become dead is, I think, does this semantic content still function in the interpretation? For computer, mouse, and leg of the table, I think those have become just dead metaphors. However, there are challenges to this account of metaphor, and one of the most interesting challenges is Davidson. And Davidson says, well, there isn't really any such thing as the intended speaker meaning. The words in a metaphorical utterance mean exactly what they literally mean and nothing else. The way metaphor works is like seeing as. What the metaphor says is see it as like that. So if I say Juliet is the sun, that's see Juliet as if she were the sun. But, says Davidson, seeing as is not the same thing as seeing that. There's no propositional content conveyed by the metaphorical utterance in addition to the actual literal content. So he says most metaphorical statements are just false statements. But the way they function is that they get us to see something as something else. And I quote a poem from Emily Dickinson: "My life had stood a loaded gun in corners till a day the owner passed, identified, and carried me away." Now, I selected that poem because it's very simple. It's not at all hard to understand it. And there, I think, you can get the metaphorical. You do get a metaphorical speaker's meaning. But Davidson would say in something like Juliet is the sun, there isn't any metaphorical speaker's meaning. There is just the seeing as. See Juliet as the sun in the same way that you see the figure as either a duck or as a rabbit when you see the ambiguous figure. Okay, so that's a question I want us to think about with metaphor. I want you to think about the problem of metaphor. And one of the ways to do this is keep your eyes out for metaphors. And I think what you'll find is that standard newspapers are full of metaphors. Sports metaphors have become tiresome. God, I mean, when the Giants were playing in the World Series, it got to be too much. But in any case, check out, well, that too much there, I think, may also be a metaphor. Excessive quantity. I'm not sure if that's literal or not in that case. Well, that's another thing. Sometimes it's hard to decide whether an expression is used metaphorically or literally. And the question I want you to think about is, or one of the questions is, does the speaker actually convey a propositional content with the utterance of a metaphor? I think that there are obviously cases where the speaker does. Why? And the proof is you can argue. You can actually argue about the propositional content. So if I say the Democrats, Obama's program has become a dead horse now that the Republicans control the House of Representatives, it seems to me you might challenge me. You might say, no, it's not a dead horse at all. He's very likely to succeed on an important number of issues, especially foreign policy issues. So those are cases where you have Where you have a debate, it seems to me you've got a propositional content that the debate is about, but it's not about expired equines. It's not about actual dead horses. It's about the speaker's meaning that is conveyed when somebody says the Democrats' program has become a dead horse in federal policy. But there may be cases where Davidson is right. There may be poetic cases where the metaphor it just asks you to, is a case of seeing as with no propositional content conveyed. One of his favorite examples is the T.S. Eliot poem about the Church of England, which begins, "The broad-backed hippopotamus rests on its belly in the mud. Although it seems so strong to us, it is merely flesh and blood." Now, says Davidson, that doesn't tell you anything true or false about the Church of England. It just asks you to see the Church of England as a broad-backed hippopotamus resting on his belly in the mud. I think that's a bit too swift. I think we're supposed to compare the Church of England with the broad-backed hippopotamus. Now, most of us never escape our early upbringing, and many of the falsehoods that we believe we had to learn in high school. Somebody ought to do a study of the catastrophic effects of false views conveyed by adolescent education. Whenever Descartes, for example, is in deep trouble, he always says, "We know this," and then he advances some absurdly false proposition. "We know it by the natural light of reason." And what he means is, I was forced to learn it by those Jesuits who taught me in high school. So when he says, "We know by the natural light of reason that there must be as much formal or eminent reality in the cause of anything as there is in the effect," he knows that by the natural light of reason, meaning he had to memorize it in high school. Now, by the natural light of reason, for a long time I knew every metaphor was a type of simile, because we had to memorize that in high school. That really, when you make a metaphorical utterance of the form S is P, you're saying S is like P, or S is similar to P in certain respects. So when I say the Democratic program's a dead horse on the Washington policy market, that is a metaphor because it says that the Democratic program is like a dead horse in certain respects. Now, it took me a long time to figure out it doesn't work. Why not? Well, to begin with, it would only explain metaphor if the similes were literal. That is, if you're asserting a literal similarity. But many of the similes are not themselves literally intended. My love is like a red, red rose. Does that mean my love is largely thorny and her petals fall off after a week or two? No, it doesn't mean that. It's not a case of a literal similarity. But worse yet, there are whole lots of metaphors where there is no literal similarity on the basis of which the metaphor is produced or understood. I think of temperature. I think of spatial metaphors for time. You say things like, the hours crawled past as we waited for the airplane to arrive, or the hours whizzed past, or the hours sped past. There are all these spatial metaphors for time. But there's no literal similarity between space and time on which these metaphors are based. If you say things like, well, the literal similarity is passage, because the hours did pass, fast or slow. That's no good. Passage is itself a spatial metaphor for time. So the spatializing of time is a case where we have a metaphor which is kind of inevitable. It's very common, but it's not based on a literal similarity. There isn't a literal similarity between space and time on which the spatial metaphors for time are based. Now, similarly, I think with temperature metaphors for personal relationships. We have a warm friendship. They engaged in a heated argument. They had a hot discussion. She's a very cold person. All of those are temperature metaphors for personal traits and personal characteristics, but it seems to me they're not based on any literal similarity. If I say Sally is a block of ice, I am not saying Sally melts at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, it's just not based on literal similarity. Now, you might say, well, look, yes, it is really based on similarity, because if you say Sally's a block of ice, you're saying she's unresponsive, the same way a block of ice is unresponsive. That won't work. Bonfires are that way unresponsive. Try to have a conversation with a bonfire, but Sally's a bonfire is a different metaphor altogether from Sally is a block of ice. And these are cases where you convey a speaker meaning, even though there's no literal similarity. And then once you start looking around for these, there's lots of them. Temperature metaphors for personal relations and traits, and then taste metaphors for character. He's a very bitter person. She's a very sweet person. You understand those easily, but they're not based on literal similarities. They're more like cases where you do see something as something else, and it's not a literal similarity between eating bitter things and having a conversation with him that gives you the metaphor for he's a very bitter person or she's a very sweet person. So there are three classes, systematic classes of metaphors that are not based on literal similarities. The spatializing of time, the temperature metaphors for personal relations, and taste metaphors for character and personality are in no case based on literal similarities. Yes? Sorry? The confabulation hypothesis? You'd have to remind me what it is. Yeah. 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 Well, that's okay. There are various theories about the origin of these, but those are theories about the genealogy, to use a metaphor here, of the metaphor. And what I'm interested in is how you understand it. Now, there are things where sometimes the genealogy does help you understand. Here's the thing that has often puzzled me: how can like become a speech act verb? It has now become a speech act verb. You hear people say things like, well, we were in the bar, and he's like, what's your sign? And I'm like, I'm a Sagittarius. Now, you hear people say that, and similar to? I don't get it. He is similar to? No. And I think, but you must have heard this. Now, it was bad enough in my childhood when people say go as a speech act verb. So he goes, how are you? And I go, I'm fine. That's bad enough. But he's like, how are you? And I'm like, I'm fine. You must have heard this. In fact, for all I know, you may have said it. You may have said things like this. What does it mean? Well, I think it is something like this. When you say, he's like, I've had too much to drink, and I'm like, have some more, what you're saying is he said something like. Does that sound plausible to you? Otherwise, it makes no sense at all. And this disturbs me. There shouldn't be, because oddly enough, crazy as it sounds, like has become a standard speech act verb among the young. What did you say? Well, I'm like, and then what follows is a speech act. And whatever like is, it's not a speech act verb. Now, it's true, English is unusual among languages in that, roughly speaking, any word can be used as a verb. Certainly, any noun in English can be used as a verb, and that's part of the wonderful flexibility of English. So, for example, it took the French 50 years to figure out that you can use ski as a verb. Only recently have they been willing to say skier, je vais skier. For 50 years they said, je vais faire du ski, meaning I'm going to go make of the ski. But in English, you can take anything as a verb. So you don't just have text messages, but you do something called text messaging. I will now text message. What did you do then? I text messaged him, and so on with these. And this is, I think it's a great thing about English, that any damn noun at all can be used as a verb. And maybe you can use any other parts of speech. Maybe like here, which is a preposition, is being used. Well, it's clearly being used as a verb, and I'm just not sure how common that is. Yes?
The thing that always got me about, he's like, she's like, is that it takes the present form of the verb to be as well.
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
like,
yeah. Yeah. Can you use it in the past? Abraham Lincoln was like 77 years ago. Can you do that? It sounds odd to me, but then I don't. I'm never like in that way. That is, I never use like as a speech act verb. It makes me acutely uncomfortable when I hear other people using it. On the other hand, I don't believe in linguistic legislation. Well, yeah, I do for some cases. I mean, people who confuse prepositions and conjunctions, like and as, there ought to be the death penalty or some version of it for that. But I'm now accustomed to split infinitives. For a long time, it gave me the creeps, split infinitives. But to elegantly split an infinitive for the purpose of showing other people that you know exactly what you're up to, that seems to me perfectly okay. All right, what are you like? I can't hear you. You say heap? You say H-E-A-P, meaning what? I see. I will track it down. It's a new one on me. I thought I could understand Strine, but this one is beyond me. Oh, we do have hyperbole for that. There were tons of people there, yeah, and that's absolutely standard hyperbole. Now, hyperbole, where you exaggerate, and metaphor and understatement are all, according to me, phenomena where speaker meaning and sentence meaning come apart. If somebody said, "Oh God, there were millions of people at the party," well, you don't think how many million, and was it really over 3 million? No, you just mean there were many people there. So that's very common, and the Australian sounds like it's doing the same thing. It sounds like the same phenomenon. And of course, the understatement, where you say, "Well, Rockefeller was rather well off." Where you convey something by stating less by you violate the Gricean maxim of quantity, of state neither too much nor too little, and people understand it as that. They understand the understatement as the same kind of mechanism, according to me at least, that they use to understand indirect speech acts and metaphors, and that is, first you have to figure out there's something wrong with the statement if construed literally, and then you have to have some procedure for figuring out what is actually being said. Okay, look, we have to stop. Now let me remind you what we're going to do. I am going to